"You're not welcome here anymore," my daughter-in-law said at dinner, her voice calm, almost polite, as if she were commenting on the weather. I didn't answer. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I simply looked down at my plate, at the food that had already gone cold. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from." I never imagined I would be telling this story, but here we are. The dining room felt wrong without my husband. For 36 years, he had sat at the head of that table, always insisting I take the chair closest to the window because I liked the light. Now his seat was empty. The mahogany table felt too large for just 3 people, like a stage set after the main actor has left. It had been 8 days since we buried him. 8 days since I stood by his grave, gripping a black umbrella while the wind cut through my coat. 8 days since neighbors told me I was strong and casseroles filled my refrigerator. And now, apparently, 8 days was long enough for me to no longer belong in my own home. My son sat across from me, staring at his plate. He was a grown man in his 40s, with a mortgage, a career, and a family of his own. But at that moment, he looked like a boy who had learned to disappear when things became uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law reached for her glass of water. Her hand didn't shake. "We've talked about this," she continued. "This arrangement just isn't working anymore." I nodded once, slowly. The words themselves weren't loud. There was no shouting, no slammed fists. That was what made them heavier. She wasn't angry. She was finished. The house smelled like rosemary chicken, a recipe I'd cooked so many times my hands knew it by memory. I had made it because it was my son's favorite. Out of habit. Out of hope, maybe. The oven timer had gone off earlier, and no one had rushed to the kitchen the way my husband used to, joking that he'd starve if dinner were ever late. I picked up my fork, put it back down. "You can stay somewhere else for a while," she added, glancing briefly at my son before looking back at me. "It'll be easier for everyone." For everyone. My son cleared his throat but said nothing. He didn't look up. Not once. I realized then that this conversation hadn't started tonight. Tonight was only the delivery. The decision had already been made. Without me, without the man who had promised more than once that I would always be safe in this house. I folded my napkin and placed it neatly on the table. My hands were steady. I noticed that, and it surprised me. "I understand," I said. My voice didn't crack. That surprised me too. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The sound echoed louder than it should have. No one moved to stop me. No one asked where I was going. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom I had shared with my husband for over 3 decades. His slippers were still by the door. His watch lay on the dresser where he'd taken it off the night before he died. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, the one I used to tease him about because it reminded me of cedar and old books. I picked up my coat. In the mirror, I saw a woman with gray hair pulled back too tightly, eyes tired but dry. I didn't recognize weakness there, only clarity. They thought this was the end of something. They were wrong. The house changed after the funeral, not in obvious ways. The walls were still the same pale beige. The floorboard still creaked near the hallway bathroom. The grandfather clock in the living room still chimed every hour, steady and indifferent. But something invisible had shifted, like air leaving a room without making a sound. The morning after that dinner, I woke up before sunrise. I always had. My husband used to joke that I was part bird, part clockwork. For years, I made coffee while he read the paper at the kitchen table, glasses sliding down his nose, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug we refused to replace. That chair was empty now. I stood in the kitchen holding the coffee pot, listening to it gurgle and click. The sound felt too loud. I poured 1 cup, then, without thinking, reached for a second mug. I stopped myself halfway. 1 cup was enough. I sat alone at the table, hands wrapped around the warmth, watching the light creep in through the blinds. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked back and forth, spraying the same stretch of lawn it always had. The world hadn't paused just because mine had. My son came down the stairs later than usual. He nodded at me, polite, distant, like someone greeting a guest instead of his mother. He poured cereal into a bowl, ate standing up, eyes fixed on his phone. "Busy day," he said, not looking at me. I nodded. "Of course." He left without asking if I needed anything. By mid-morning, I noticed small things. a cardboard box by the coat closet, empty hangers missing from the laundry room, the spare bedroom door closed, even though it was usually left open. No one explained. No one needed to. Grief had a strange way of making you sharper. I wasn't crying anymore. I was observing. I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar surfaces. The banister my husband had refinished himself one summer, sanding it smooth while humming off-key. The framed photo of our son at age 10, missing 2 front teeth, grinning like he owned the world. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed the comforter. His side was still untouched. The pillow still held the faint outline of his head. I pressed my hand there for just a moment, then pulled it back. I checked my purse, my wallet, my keys. All there. At lunch, my daughter-in-law reheated leftovers without asking if I wanted any. She ate quickly, scrolling on her phone, then left the plate in the sink. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway felt final somehow, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to. In the afternoon, a woman from church stopped by with a casserole. She hugged me too tightly and told me I was handling everything so well. I thanked her. She left. The casserole went into the freezer with 3 others. That evening, I sat in the living room as the sky darkened, the lamp casting a small circle of light around me. The house felt bigger than it ever had. Not emptier. Bigger. I realized something then. They weren't waiting for me to fall apart. They were waiting for me to leave. And as the clock chimed 8 times, steady and calm, I understood that whatever came next, it wouldn't be decided by them alone. By the 3rd day, the house no longer felt like mine. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. It showed in the way doors were closed, in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, in the way my presence became something to work around. That morning, I went to the laundry room to wash a small load of clothes. My detergent, the one I'd used for years because my skin reacted to anything stronger, was gone. In its place sat a large bottle of something heavily scented. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, then quietly put my clothes back into the basket. Later, I noticed my mail stacked neatly on the corner of the kitchen counter instead of opened and sorted like it used to be. A silent system had been created without me. Bills I normally handled were now being redirected. Decisions were being made. Lines were being drawn. At lunch, my son avoided sitting down altogether. He hovered by the counter, eating quickly, eyes darting to the clock. "You okay, Mom?" he asked finally. "Yes," I said. That was all he needed. In the afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone in the living room. She didn't know I was in the hallway. "She'll manage," she said. "It's better this way. She needs structure. People her age do." Her voice was calm, confident, as if she were talking about reorganizing a closet, not dismantling a life. I stepped back quietly before she could see me. I didn't want her to stop talking on my account. I wanted to hear what she said when she thought I wasn't listening. That evening, I opened the hall closet to get my scarf and found a suitcase inside. Not mine. New. Empty. Placed there deliberately. I closed the door gently. After dinner, my daughter-in-law handed my son a folder. I recognized the color immediately. Pale blue. The same kind my husband used to keep important papers in. They spoke in low voices. I caught words here and there. Timing. Logistics. Temporary. Temporary was a word they liked. It sounded harmless, reasonable. It made everything easier to justify. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. I noticed my jewelry box was lighter. Not empty. Just curated. The pieces I wore most often were there. The rest had been moved somewhere else. And I knew then that this wasn't about grief, or concern, or what was best for me. It was about control. They were slowly rearranging the house around me, hoping I wouldn't notice until there was nowhere left for me to stand. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of the thermostat, familiar noises that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. My husband used to say that a home remembers who built it. I wondered if that was true. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling and made a quiet decision. I wouldn't ask questions, I wouldn't argue, and I wouldn't leave until I understood exactly what they thought they were taking from me. That night, memories came without invitation. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint crack near the corner where my husband once joked the house was settling, just like us. He had said it with a smile, as if time was something gentle. Back then, I believed him. We had met young. Too young, my mother said. We built this life piece by piece. I remembered painting these walls ourselves, arguing over colors, laughing when paint ended up in our hair instead of on the brush. He always let me choose in the end. You're the one who has to live with it every day, he'd say. For decades, I did. He handled the heavy things, repairs, insurance, the mortgage, not because I couldn't, but because he wanted to. And I handled everything else. Meals, birthdays, doctor appointments, school forms, the invisible work that keeps a family upright. When our son was born, I stayed up nights rocking him while my husband slept so he could work the next day. When money was tight, I clipped coupons and mended clothes instead of buying new ones. When my husband's business struggled one winter, I sold a bracelet my mother gave me and never told him. This house didn't just belong to us, it was us. I remembered the night my husband sat me down at this very table, years ago, folding his hands the way he did when something mattered. If anything ever happens to me, he said, this house is yours. Always. I made sure of it. I believed him, not because of paperwork, because of the way he said it. The next morning, I woke early again, out of habit, out of memory. I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair, looking at the woman in the mirror. Her face was older now, softer, lines where laughter and worry had lived side by side. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes I had worn 100 times, comfortable, familiar. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. In the kitchen, my daughter-in-law moved around me as if I were furniture. She opened cabinets, closed drawers, rearranged small things. A mug placed somewhere else. A stack of papers shifted. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. I sat at the table, hands folded, watching. My son passed through the room, keys in hand. He hesitated for a moment as if he might say something. Then he didn't. That silence hurt more than words ever could. Later, I went into the living room and stood in front of the framed photos. Weddings. Holidays. Smiling faces. I realized something then. In every picture, I was standing just slightly to the side. Close, but not centered. Useful, but not essential. That hadn't changed. What had changed was that my husband was no longer there to quietly pull me back to the middle. I touched the arm of the sofa where he used to sit, the fabric worn smooth by years of his weight. The house remembered him. I could feel it. They thought time had weakened me. They were wrong. Time had taught me patience. And as I stood there surrounded by a lifetime of proof, I knew this wasn't just grief rising in my chest. It was memory. And memory, I was beginning to understand, was power. The confirmation came quietly. Not in a confrontation. Not in an argument. It arrived the way most truths do when you're not being lied to anymore, through overheard words and careless confidence. I was in the hallway when I heard my name. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen, her voice low but steady. My son stood with her. I couldn't see them, but I didn't need to. We should talk to the realtor next week, she said, before she gets too settled. There was a pause. She's still grieving, my son replied. His voice lacked conviction. That's exactly why now is better, she said. She won't fight it. She'll just go along with whatever we suggest. I stayed where I was. I didn't move closer. I didn't step away. I listened. We can frame it as concern, she continued. Smaller place, less responsibility, something temporary. Temporary again. My son sighed. She built her life here. She built a life with your father, my daughter-in-law corrected. He's gone. That sentence landed heavier than the first one had days earlier. I backed away before they noticed me. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. Everything inside me felt strangely calm, like the moment after a storm has already passed. Later that afternoon, a man knocked on the door. He wore a polo shirt with a logo stitched on the chest and held a clipboard under his arm. Just measuring for future reference. My daughter-in-law said brightly when she saw my expression. Nothing official. The man nodded politely and walked through the house, measuring walls, windows, door frames. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't need to. I wasn't part of the plan. I watched from the living room chair as numbers were written down. Square footage, angles, exits. My home reduced to data. That evening, my daughter-in-law left brochures on the kitchen counter, retirement communities, condos. Clean, bright images of smiling seniors I didn't recognize. She didn't hand them to me. She didn't have to. My son glanced at them, then at me. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I'll look later," I said. He nodded, relieved. That night, I sat alone at the table long after they'd gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I picked up one of the brochures and turned it over. Small print. Monthly fees. Shared spaces. I thought of my husband's hands on these same pages years ago, signing papers, building something meant to last longer than either of us. I folded the brochure carefully and placed it back where it had been. They believed they were being subtle. They believed grief had made me pliable. But what grief had really done was strip away my need to pretend. I saw it clearly now. This wasn't about helping me move forward. It was about moving me out of the way. And once I understood that, everything else began to fall into place. The person who helped me didn't come from inside the family. She came from the past. Her name was Linda. We'd been neighbors for over 20 years, long before my son married, long before my husband's hair turned gray. She lived 3 houses down, the kind of woman who remembered anniversaries and brought soup without being asked. She knocked on my door mid-morning while my daughter-in-law was out. "I saw a man measuring your windows yesterday," she said, stepping inside. "Everything all right?" I poured her coffee. Black, the way she liked it. I didn't answer right away. "They're thinking it might be time for me to downsize," I said finally. Linda didn't respond with pity. She sat very still, eyes focused on the mug in her hands. "That's interesting," she said, "considering whose name is actually on this house." I looked up. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope. Old, yellowed at the edges. "Your husband asked me to hold on to this years ago," she said, "in case something ever happened and things got complicated." Inside were copies, deeds, addendums, signatures I recognized instantly. My husband's handwriting was unmistakable, careful, deliberate, precise. My name was there, not added as an afterthought, not penciled in later, centered, clear. "He was worried about exactly this," Linda said quietly. "He didn't trust that they'd do right by you once he was gone." I ran my fingers over the paper, slowly, steadily. Everything I'd been told these past days, that I was temporary, that decisions weren't mine, that I was just present, fell apart in that moment. Linda leaned forward. "He made sure you were protected. He just didn't want you to feel like you had to use it unless you needed to." I folded the papers and slipped them back into the envelope. "I understand," I said. That afternoon, after Linda left, I sat alone in the living room and let the quiet settle around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I was awake. Later, my son came home early. He seemed tense, restless. "Mom," he said, hovering near the doorway, "have you thought more about those brochures?" I looked at him. Really looked. He was tired, pulled in 2 directions, but he wasn't confused. He knew what was happening. "I've thought," I said. He waited, hoping for something easy. "I won't be leaving," I added. He blinked. "We're just trying to help." "I know," I said, and let the silence do the rest. That night, I went through my old files. Not frantically, methodically. Bank statements, insurance documents, things I'd helped organize for decades but had been told, gently and repeatedly, were handled. They weren't handled without me. They never had been. As I placed everything back where it belonged, I understood something clearly for the first time. My daughter-in-law believed I was alone. My son believed I would bend. They both believed grief had softened me. What none of them realized was that grief had done the opposite. It had stripped away the noise. And now that I knew where I stood, legally, quietly, undeniably, I could finally decide what came next. On my terms. After that, I became very careful. Not outwardly. On the surface, nothing changed. I still woke early. I still washed my cup after breakfast. I still folded my clothes and kept my side of the closet neat. I let them believe I was doing what they expected, adjusting, shrinking, preparing. Inside, I was counting. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked her phone now, how she spoke more confidently, more quickly, as if time were on her side. I noticed how my son avoided long conversations with me, how he left the room when things grew quiet. They were waiting. They expected grief to finish its work. At dinner, my daughter-in-law spoke about logistics. Always logistics. Moving trucks, storage units, schedules. She used words like simpler and easier, as if life could be reduced to a checklist. I listened. I nodded when it was appropriate. I didn't challenge anything. That seemed to relax her. One evening, she said, "You're taking this better than I thought." I looked up from my plate. "There's no point in making things harder than they already are." She smiled, a small, satisfied smile. After that, she stopped being careful. She left papers out on the counter, notes, phone messages. She assumed I wouldn't read them, or that if I did, I wouldn't understand. She had already decided who I was in her mind. An obstacle, not an owner. I spent more time alone in my room. That, too, pleased them. They mistook distance for surrender. At night, I wrote things down. Not feelings. Facts. Dates. Conversations. Names. I wrote them slowly, clearly, in a notebook I'd kept since my son was born. The handwriting inside had changed over the years, but it was all mine. I remembered my husband teaching our son to ride a bike in the driveway, running behind him, hands just inches from the seat. "Let him think he's doing it alone," he'd said to me. "That's how confidence grows." The thought stayed with me. During the day, I made small preparations, quiet ones. I gathered documents and returned them to their proper places. I memorized account numbers. I reviewed statements I'd helped manage long before anyone decided I was no longer capable. I didn't confront anyone. There was no need. My son watched me more closely now. I could tell. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. "Do you need help with anything?" he said one afternoon. "No," I replied. "I'm managing." That answer unsettled him. In the living room, my daughter-in-law laughed on the phone, talking about plans that didn't include me. She spoke freely, assuming I wasn't listening. She was wrong. They believed silence meant consent. They believed patience meant weakness. They believed time was working against me. They didn't understand that I had lived long enough to know the value of waiting. That some things are best handled not with urgency, but with precision. And as I sat there, listening to their confidence grow, I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. Because the quieter I became, the more they revealed, and I was learning everything I needed to know. By then, my routine had become deliberate. Every morning, I woke before anyone else, not because I couldn't sleep, but because the quiet gave me space to think. I made my coffee, sat at the table, and reviewed what I already knew. Not emotionally, practically. I checked the calendar on the wall, appointments circled in my daughter-in-law's handwriting, calls she planned to make, meetings that didn't include me. I memorized them, then left the calendar exactly as it was. I began sorting through my belongings with intention. Not packing. Sorting. There's a difference. I separated what mattered from what didn't. Documents went into one folder, personal items into another. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. Grief teaches you patience if you let it. One afternoon, I went to the bank alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I hadn't done that in years. The building smelled the same, clean, faintly metallic. The teller recognized me. She smiled and asked how I'd been. "I've been managing," I said. She nodded and slid paperwork across the counter. No raised eyebrows, no concern, just process, just confirmation. When I returned home, my daughter-in-law was on the phone, pacing the living room. She paused when she saw me, then turned her back slightly. "Yes, that should work," she said. "Soon." Soon was another word she liked. I walked past her and into my room. I closed the door gently. I placed the documents I'd brought back in the bottom drawer of my dresser, beneath folded sweaters. They were safer there than anywhere else. That evening, my son asked if I'd been out. "Just errands," I replied. He nodded, uncertain. He was starting to feel that something was happening without him. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. Dinner was quiet. My daughter-in-law spoke about timelines again. She mentioned a date. Not specific, just close enough to feel real. "We'll figure it out," she said, smiling at my son. I took a sip of water, said nothing. Afterward, I washed my plate and dried it carefully. I noticed she didn't bother to hide her impatience anymore. She stood watching, arms crossed, waiting for me to finish as if the sink were already hers. I stepped aside when I was done. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my notebook. I added one more line, one more confirmation. Then I closed it. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. My husband used to say that most people give themselves away long before they realize it. All you had to do was watch. Let them talk. Let them move too fast. They thought I was behind. They thought I was tired. They thought I was almost gone. As I turned off the light and lay back against the pillows, I felt something solid settle in my chest. Not hope, not revenge. Clarity. Everything was ready. All that remained was timing. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening. They chose it carefully. After dinner. After the dishes were done. When the house was quiet and there would be no witnesses. My daughter-in-law sat at the table, hands folded, posture practiced. My son stood near the counter, pretending to be busy with nothing. I remained seated. "We need to talk about next steps," she said. Her tone was gentle, professional, the kind people use when they've already decided the outcome. I waited. She slid a sheet of paper across the table, 1 page, typed, clean margins. "We've been looking at timelines," she continued. "It would be best if you could move by the end of next month." End of next month. My son finally looked at me then. His eyes searched my face as if hoping to find tears, or relief, or something that would make this easier. I saw none of that reflected back at him. "That gives you plenty of time," she added quickly. "No rush. We want this to feel respectful." Respectful. I picked up the paper and glanced at it once. I didn't read every word. I didn't need to. I folded it neatly and placed it beside my plate. "I see," I said. My daughter-in-law exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Good. I knew you'd understand." My son nodded. "It's just a lot for everyone right now." I looked at him, at the boy I'd once taught to tie his shoes who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "You're right," I said. "It is." They relaxed after that. They mistook agreement for surrender. She began talking more freely, about repainting the living room, about opening up the kitchen, about how much light the house would have once it was less crowded. I listened, quietly. At one point she said, "Of course, we'll need the bedroom cleared soon, so we can start planning." I met her eyes for the first time that evening. "That won't be necessary," I said. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I won't be clearing it." I replied. The room shifted. My son frowned. "Mom, we just talked about this." "I know," I said, "and I've been thinking as well." My daughter-in-law's smile tightened. "We're trying to be patient." "So am I said. Silence stretched between us. Not awkward, not heated, just exposed. "This house," she said carefully, "is part of our future." I nodded once. "It's part of mine too." My son opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He looked between us, uncertain, uncomfortable. "We'll talk again," my daughter-in-law said finally, standing up. "After you've had more time to process." She gathered the paper and slid it into her folder, as if the conversation had simply been postponed. I remained seated. After they went upstairs, I stayed at the table listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The same sounds I'd heard for decades. The ones they thought no longer belonged to me. They believed this was a negotiation. They believed I would bend once pressure was applied. They believed the matter was still open. They were wrong. That night, I returned the folded paper to my drawer, placing it carefully beneath documents they had never bothered to look for. I turned off the light and went to bed knowing something they didn't. The conversation they thought was coming next would not go the way they expected. The shift happened the next morning, not with raised voices, not with accusations. It happened the moment I stopped behaving the way they expected. I woke early, as always. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and the coat my husband had bought me years ago. I moved through the house without hurry, without hesitation. My daughter-in-law was already in the kitchen, typing on her phone. She glanced up when she saw me, surprised by something she couldn't name. "I'll be out for a bit," I said. She didn't ask where. She assumed it didn't matter. At mid-morning, I returned with an envelope in my hand. Thick, heavy, real. I set it on the dining table where they'd held their quiet meetings. My son came downstairs first. He stopped when he saw it. "What's that?" he asked. "Something we should look at together," I said. My daughter-in-law entered a moment later. Her eyes went to the envelope immediately. Her posture stiffened, just slightly. I opened it slowly and laid the papers out flat. Deeds, copies, dates, signatures, my name, centered, clear, repeated. I thought there might be confusion, I said, so I wanted to make sure we were all working with the same information. My son leaned closer, scanning the page. His brow furrowed. "That can't be right," he said. "It is," I replied. My daughter-in-law picked up one sheet, then another. Her confidence drained quietly, like water from a glass tipped too far. "These are copies," she said. "They are," I agreed. "The originals are filed." "Filed where?" she asked. "With the county," I said. "And the bank." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, not the polite kind. "You told us," my son began. "I told you what your father told me," I said, and he kept his word. My daughter-in-law set the papers down carefully, too carefully. "There must be a mistake," she said. "We were under the impression—" "That impression," I said, "was incorrect." My son rubbed his temples. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. "So, what does this mean?" he asked. "It means," I said evenly, "that I'm not moving." My daughter-in-law's voice tightened. "This changes things." "Yes," I said, "it does." She stood up, pacing once before stopping. "We were planning based on a different understanding." "I know," I said. My son looked at me then, really looked. Not as someone to manage, not as someone to move along, as someone he had underestimated. "You knew this the whole time?" he asked quietly. "I knew," I said, "and I waited." My daughter-in-law crossed her arms. "You should have told us." "There was no need," I replied. "You were very clear about your intentions." No one spoke after that. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. I gathered the papers and returned them to the envelope. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. "I'll be in my room," I said. As I walked away, I heard my daughter-in-law speak in a low voice. Urgent, controlled, nothing like before. They had planned for grief. They had planned for silence. They had not planned for certainty. And for the first time since my husband died, the house felt balanced again. After that, I stopped explaining myself. There was no announcement, no victory, just a quiet shift in how I moved through the house. I no longer waited to be addressed. I no longer adjusted my schedule around theirs. I made coffee when I wanted. I watched the news in the living room again. I opened windows without asking. My daughter-in-law noticed first. She became careful, measured. Her voice softened in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She asked questions she hadn't asked before, questions meant to test boundaries. "Are you planning to go out today? Do you need the car? Should we coordinate dinner?" I answered politely, briefly, nothing more. My son watched us both, caught somewhere between habit and reality. He lingered in doorways now. He hesitated before speaking. Sometimes he looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. One evening, he knocked on my bedroom door. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I looked up from my book. "We are talking." He stood there for a moment, then nodded and left. He hadn't known what he wanted to say, only that something had changed. I began spending more time outside the house, not to escape it, but to remind myself of who I was beyond it. I walked the same streets I'd walked for decades. I spoke to neighbors who remembered my husband, who remembered me. "You still here?" one of them said with a smile. "Yes," I replied. "I am." At home, my daughter-in-law started reorganizing less. She no longer moved my things. She no longer spoke about timelines. The brochures disappeared from the counter. In their place was something quieter. Uncertainty. I packed a small suitcase one afternoon, not to leave, but to choose. I placed it by the closet, zipped, neat. I let it be seen. That night at dinner, my daughter-in-law glanced at it and said nothing. My son noticed. He looked at me, then away. Later, as I folded laundry, I realized something important. I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. That was the difference. I sat in my room that evening, holding my husband's watch in my hand. The weight of it was familiar, steady. He had trusted me with this life, with this home. I trusted myself now. Whatever came next wouldn't be forced. It wouldn't be rushed. It would be chosen. And as I turned off the light, listening to the quiet settle around me, I understood that leaving or staying meant nothing if it wasn't on my terms. For the first time since his death, I felt something close to peace. Not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer being decided without me. The morning I chose to leave, I woke before sunrise. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. I stood at the bedroom window and watched the sky lighten slowly, the same way I had on countless mornings beside my husband. Nothing in the room had changed, and yet everything had. I dressed carefully, not formally, just deliberately. I packed the small suitcase I had prepared days earlier. Only what mattered. Clothes I loved, a photo, my husband's watch, nothing rushed, nothing forgotten. When I stepped into the hallway, my daughter-in-law was already awake. She stood in the kitchen, frozen when she saw the suitcase. "You're leaving?" she asked. "Yes," I said. My son appeared behind her. He looked startled, then uncertain, then something else. Understanding, maybe? "Is this because of us?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, this is because of me." I didn't wait for permission. I didn't ask for approval. I picked up my coat and moved toward the door. My daughter-in-law stepped aside without thinking. For the first time, she didn't block my path. At the threshold, I paused. "This house," I said quietly, "will always matter to me, but I don't need walls to know who I am." My son swallowed. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere I choose," I replied. I opened the door and stepped into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the street I had lived on for most of my adult life. The same street where I raised my son. The same street where I had learned how to endure. I didn't look back. Later that day, I sat in a small, sunlit apartment with a single suitcase by the door. The space was modest, quiet, mine. I placed my husband's watch on the bedside table and sat down on the edge of the bed. I felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tired. In the weeks that followed, my son called, sometimes. He spoke differently now, slower, careful. My daughter-in-law stayed mostly silent. That was fine. Silence had taught me everything I needed to know. I learned how to fill my days again. Walks, coffee with Linda, evenings where I read until the light faded and no one rushed me. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't triumphant. I was complete. I had been told I was no longer welcome, that I had become a burden, that my place had expired with my husband's last breath. They were wrong. My place was never something they could take from me. It lived in the years I had given, the life I had built, the strength I had carried quietly long before anyone thought to test it. And now, as I sit here telling you this story, I understand something clearly. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't staying to prove your worth. It's leaving, whole, dignified, and unafraid, knowing you never lost it in the first place.